Before COVID, we had a GDP growth projection of 6.8%. But post-COVID, this has actually gone down to 0.9%. We had expected a year-end inflation of 8.0% and a fiscal deficit of 4.7% of GDP. But COVID struck, and we had to readjust our GDP growth. And as we have it right now, we are projecting 0.9% GDP growth. We are expecting to see a projected primary surplus of 0.7% of GDP, and still a gross national reserve to cover not less than 3.5 months of import cash. But I must say that the pandemic has significantly affected not just us, but the whole world, because a lot of supply chains were significantly disrupted, and many countries were locked down, so it couldn't be business as usual. People couldn't travel, you couldn't have meetings, and almost every country was on lockdown for quite a while, at least 2 or 3 months. And what has happened since then? It's a matter of history that everybody knows. Inflation in Ghana increased to 10.6% in April, and then to 11.2% in June. But we're expecting that year inflation rates will be 12.7% and reduce further from 2021, and hopefully we'll get to single digits by 2022. We also saw a fall in economic activity as measured by the Central Bank's Composite Index of Economic Activity, which dropped by 2.2% in March 2020. But as we speak, although we have a projection of 0.9, if you go to the World Bank's, the IMF's website, they have a projection of 1.5%. And recently, Goldman Sachs actually came out to say, well, no, maybe you are being overly hard on yourself. We expect 1.2% GDP growth. So we have definitely done something good, whilst many other countries are in deep recession and have resorted to large borrowings. We are not going to go into that sort of deep recession. So we have done something well, and that has also affected, GIPC in what we had planned for the year, but in a very interesting way, because if you look at what has happened in the first quarter, going to the second quarter, we realized the impact. The impact, and hospitality, of course, was one of the worst hit. We had about almost 1,000, accommodation facilities had to shut down by 31st May, actually 979, if you put it that way, which was about a quarter of all the, facilities that we had. And job losses were somewhere about 2,300 people. The tour operators saw a drop in visits by some 11,558 out of cancellations, which represented at least about almost 5 million cedis. But the agricultural sector was also significantly hit because people couldn't go to the farms of the fear of catching the disease. So we saw a decline in the price of some like cashew, which has become a major export, by 60% between January and April, and which was significant for the farmers and for the exporters. We also saw a drop in the energy sector, with about close to $324 million projects actually being shelved as a result, or stalled as a result of the pandemic. Of course, the transport sector was also significantly affected. And if you look at the Metro Mass Transport, for example, they dropped revenues of 5.5 million a month, to about 2.1 million a month. That means that more than 50% of the revenues that they made were gone, or maybe close to 60%. The educational sector also suffered. Some 856 job losses in 32 private schools that couldn't pay them because kids were not going to school. They had to sit at home. The schools were closed. So and this was just in the second quarter of 2020. So this is significant. The impact on the economy at large was significant. But over GIPC, we saw very interesting dynamics, because in the first quarter, we actually registered foreign direct investment of $180 million, which was some 400% increase on what we had the previous year, in the first quarter of 2019. So that was very optimistic, and we had great hopes of continuing the year in very good shape and in good tracks. And then COVID hit. And for the first 2 months of March, April, we barely had any inflows. We barely had any visits. Of course, we had lots of calls because a lot of investors were asking how we're going to cope with this, what the other measures we're doing. We ourselves did our own research to find the impact on investors. And just in 1 month, the average revenue loss or cost to each investor was about $75,000. That was the minimum, but it was the average. But we're expecting that was going to increase because by May, June, then almost all enterprises had to be shut down and lockdowns, etc., and quarantines and all that. So the impact was real. But then come June, and we realized that we had actually increased the amount of foreign direct investment that we had. By the beginning of June, the number for the second quarter was $207 million, an increase over the first quarter. And by the end of June itself, we had close to $650 million in foreign direct investment, which was was enigmatic and confusing because we expected that we'll see FDI drop significantly, but we didn't see that. So we are still extremely hopeful. But what it tells you is that for the investor, they look at where the opportunity is. They look at the macro and they look at who is still performing well under the pandemic and target it. So I believe that is what has put us where we are. We are still very optimistic. We are doing new things in new ways to ensure that we recover quickly and then get back to the track on which we were before COVID.